If you crave the truth they tried to bury, subscribe now. Because what happened inside Attica wasn't just a riot, it was a war. The tear gas hadn't even cleared when the shooting started. September 13, 1971. Dawn hung low over western New York as state troopers crouched behind armored vehicles outside Attica Correctional Facility. Inside the yard, more than 1,000 inmates stood exposed beneath a gray sky, some barefoot, some shirtless, all exhausted after 4 days of chaos. Hostages, correctional officers and civilian staff, were bound nearby, blindfolded, caught between fear and fragile hope. Then the helicopters came. They circled once, twice. Gas canisters dropped from above, hissing as they hit the ground. A white cloud swallowed the yard. Men choked, staggered, screamed. Visibility vanished. And then the gunfire erupted. Within minutes, it was over. Bodies lay motionless across the concrete. 43 men would be dead before the morning ended, 10 of them hostages. Blood pooled where negotiations had once stood a chance. The uprising at Attica Prison had reached its violent conclusion. But to understand how a maximum security prison turned into a battlefield, you have to go back 4 days. September 9th. It began with a misunderstanding, a minor altercation between inmates and guards. Tension had been building for months. Attica was overcrowded, understaffed, and racially divided. Nearly 60% of the incarcerated men were black or Latino. Most of the guards were white, many commuting from rural towns nearby. Resentment simmered on both sides of the bars. When a gate was mistakenly left unsecured, a small scuffle exploded into something far bigger. Inmates surged through cell blocks, overpowering guards. Within hours, they controlled large sections of the prison, including the exercise yard known as D-Yard. 39 staff members were taken hostage. But this wasn't mindless chaos. Almost immediately, inmate leaders organized themselves. They created security patrols. They protected hostages from harm. They drafted a list of demands: basic medical care, religious freedom, fair wages for prison labor, an end to brutality. They asked for outside observers to ensure transparency. Civil rights attorneys arrived. Journalists gathered outside the gates. Even politicians were called in to negotiate. Among the decision-makers watching from afar was New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He refused to step inside. For 4 days, negotiations stretched on. Food was rationed. Tempers flared. Rumors spread about beatings, about executions, about plots to kill hostages. Outside the walls, the nation watched through television screens, unsure who to believe. Inside D-Yard, inmate spokesman Elliot James, L.D., Barkley addressed the crowd. "We are men. We are not beasts," he declared. But patience was running out. On the night of September 12th, state officials made a decision that would change everything. Tactical teams assembled in silence. Shotguns were loaded. Maps were drawn. The official plan was labeled a retaking operation. By sunrise, it would become something else entirely. And as investigators would later discover, the first shots fired that morning weren't the ones the public was told about. What really happened in that cloud of gas would unravel into one of the most controversial cover-ups in American prison history. When the shooting stopped, the silence was worse. D-Yard looked like a battlefield. Inmates lay face down on wet concrete. Hostages were sprawled where they had fallen. State troopers moved through the haze with shotguns still raised, shouting orders at men who were already broken. Survivors were forced to strip naked, crawl through mud, and run a gauntlet of rifle butts and batons. The official word to the press came quickly. The hostages had died at the hands of the inmates. It was a lie that spread across America in hours. Reporters repeated it. Radios echoed it. Families of the dead believed it. But inside a temporary morgue set up near Attica Correctional Facility, coroners began to notice something that didn't match the story. The wounds on the hostages were clean, high-velocity gunshot injuries. Not makeshift blades. Not strangulation. Bullets. Every single hostage had been killed by law enforcement gunfire. The revelation should have stopped everything. Instead, it was buried. State officials doubled down. insisting confusion clouded early autopsies. Press conferences framed the retaking as necessary force. The public was told that dangerous men had forced the state's hand. Behind closed doors, investigators were warned to be careful with their language. Meanwhile, survivors inside Attica were living a different nightmare. In the days that followed, inmates reported severe beatings. Some were allegedly burned with cigarettes. Others were forced to run naked through lines of guards swinging clubs. Medical care was delayed. Access to lawyers was restricted. The message was clear: control had been re-established, and no one inside those walls would challenge it again. Outside, families of both inmates and hostages demanded answers. Civil rights attorneys pushed for an independent investigation into the Attica Prison uprising. They wanted to know who gave the final order, why negotiations were abandoned, whether lethal force was truly the only option. All roads led back to Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He had been urged to visit the prison during negotiations. He refused. He had authorized the retaking operation. And now, as questions mounted, he avoided public scrutiny. Privately, advisors worried about political fallout. Publicly, he framed the assault as a tragic necessity. But cracks were forming. Leaked internal memos suggested officials knew early on that hostages had not been killed by inmates. Audio recordings revealed frantic confusion among troopers during the assault. Some officers later admitted they fired blindly into the gas-filled yard. The narrative of a calculated massacre by prisoners was collapsing. Then came the photographs. Images smuggled out showed inmates stripped, wounded, humiliated. One photo in particular, men crawling naked across the yard under armed guard, ignited outrage. The country began to ask a different question. Was this a rescue mission or revenge? A special prosecutor was appointed. Grand juries were convened. Testimony dragged on for years. But indictments against state officials never came. Instead, dozens of inmates were charged. Many cases quietly dissolved, lost in legal fog. For the families of the dead hostages, grief mixed with betrayal. For the families of slain inmates, the fight for truth had only begun. And just when it seemed the scandal might fade into history, a sealed set of state documents surfaced, files that investigators had never publicly acknowledged. Inside were handwritten notes detailing who fired first. And they didn't match the official timeline at all. The sealed files were never meant to be seen. They had been boxed, catalogued, and quietly stored away in state archives, buried beneath legal language and political caution. But when portions of those documents finally surfaced years later, they told a story far more chaotic than the clean narrative presented to the public. Handwritten notes from state investigators revealed that many troopers had fired without clear lines of sight. Some admitted they couldn't see who they were shooting at through the tear gas. Others described panic, men reacting to noise, to movement, to fear. There was no coordinated execution by inmates. There was confusion. There was poor communication. There was lethal force unleashed in a cloud of white smoke. The official timeline began to unravel. For decades, families of the dead inmates fought for recognition. They argued that the state had not only used excessive force but had actively misled the nation. Lawsuits were filed. Appeals were made. Evidence was re-examined. The legal battle stretched across generations. Meanwhile, the political landscape had shifted. The uprising at Attica Prison uprising had become a symbol of systemic neglect, of racial tension, of a correctional system pushed to its breaking point. What happened at Attica Correctional Facility was no longer just a riot. It was a reckoning. In 2000, nearly 3 decades after the gunfire stopped, New York State agreed to a settlement with surviving inmates and families of those killed. Millions of dollars were paid out, not as an admission of intentional wrongdoing, but as closure. For some, it was validation. For others, it was far too little. No state official was ever criminally convicted for the deaths that morning. And the hostages' families? They reached their own settlement years earlier, after learning the painful truth. Their loved ones had not been executed by prisoners. They had been caught in crossfire from the very operation meant to save them. The final blow to the original narrative came quietly. Audio tapes and internal reports confirmed what many had long suspected. The state knew within hours that the hostages were killed by police gunfire. Yet the false claim blaming inmates was allowed to circulate publicly for days. In the end, the violence inside those walls wasn't the only tragedy. It was the silence that followed. The silence of officials protecting reputations. The silence of reports sealed away. The silence forced upon men who survived the yard. Attica changed American prisons. Reforms were promised. Oversight increased. But the deeper scars, distrust between inmates and authorities, between communities and the state, never fully healed. 43 men died in 4 days. Some were guards. Some were inmates. All were human. And the most haunting part? The war inside Attica didn't end when the shooting stopped. It continued in courtrooms, in headlines, and in the memories of those who lived through it. A battle over truth that lasted longer than the uprising itself. They called it a retaking. They called it necessary. They called it control restored. But history remembers it differently. If this story unsettled you, that's because it should. And if you think this was the last time power and fear collided behind prison walls, you're not ready for what comes next.